Thank you. Madam Secretary, so far today I've said good morning, good afternoon,
You all serving
good
breakfast,
evening.
Congressman?
So let me go ahead and say good night. You know, I may be the only person on this side that doesn't really care about your personal email because I know that I think you said Colin Powell had one. The thing that bothers me is that it was a personal server. I think that's the difference because Mr. Powell's emails all went through the State Department server. So just to clarify it, I think the problem is that you had the full control of your emails because they were on a private server and not the government server. The other thing I'd like to say is to Ms. Duckworth, if you would read the testimony of the number of diplomat security agents that served in Benghazi, most of them were temporary duty, 45, 60 day people that served. If you'll read that, I think you'll find that a lot of these things that the Secretary said as far as enhancements was paid for by petty cash out of their own money and not really fulfilled or completed. The other thing I want to ask you, Madam Secretary.
Will the gentleman yield for just 20 seconds?
Yeah.
I think that's why it behooves us as members of Congress to increase the security budget for the State Department. They routinely get less than they need, and I think that Americans in general would not begrudge more money for security to safeguard our diplomats. But I agree with you that the report does say that.
Well, reclaiming my time, there was $20 million that she was going to send to Libya for their security upgrades. You mentioned the sixth man, that you had to wait on the sixth man.
The fifth man, I'm sorry.
Okay, all right. I was going to say there must have been somebody hiding in the closet or something that we didn't know about. You also said in one of the last things that the State Department sent more security from Tripoli to Benghazi during the attack. Mm-hmm. There was not a State Department person on that plane. There were 4 GRS agents and 2 TDY DOD people and an interpreter.
Well, that is exactly right, and that's why the cooperation and coordination that I've been talking about with Congress.
From all the information we've got, Mr. Glenn Daugherty is the one that said we are going down to help our brothers, and he got permission from the chief of station to go, and he took 3 other GRS agents. And then he got the 2 DOD guys that wanted to go, volunteered to go. They took their interpreter, they chartered the plane, and they went down there. It was not a State Department deal. And in fact, if you want to know the truth, the only option that the State Department had was the FEST team, as you and I talked about before. Now, you mentioned that it was for rebuilding, and I've got the State Department thing here about the FEST, and I would read it, but it's going to take up too much of my time, but there's not anything it doesn't say anything about rebuilding anything. It says that it's for crisis management expertise, time-sensitive information, planning for contingency operations, hostage negotiating expertise, which we thought at one time that the ambassador may have been kidnapped, reach back to Washington, D.C. agencies, and specialized communications capabilities. Now, that's what it says on the State Department website. And, you know, that would have been the one thing that you could have done to get people on the way over there to help those folks that were still in an ongoing battle that was ready to go, sitting there. But you know what? That plane never got out of the hangar. Those people never got assembled. And we've got a chain of emails that the first recommendation came back as the fest from your own people, and then the FBI told your employees that the way to handle the situation was to send the fest team, and that was the way it had always been done. So did you make the decision not to send the fest team?
Well, Congressman, first let me say that it's important to recognize that our Deputy Chief of Mission, Greg Hicks, was fully engaged in helping to put together the team that flew from Tripoli to Benghazi, and we were very grateful that the CIA station chief and his colleagues were behind that, and we were, very appreciative. They, as you know, didn't get there in time because the attack on the compound was very swift. It was over in less than an hour, but they did help eventually to evacuate, and it was just an additional tragedy that Mr. Doherty's lost his life in attempting to stave off the attack on the CIA annex. With regard to the FEST recommendation, everything you read was no longer applicable to our compound in Benghazi. Unlike the FEST team responding in Nairobi, where we were going to have an ongoing embassy presence, that was our embassy, the FEST team was very much involved in helping to stand up the communications and literally begin to get the embassy function again, despite the fact that Americans and many of the locally employed staff had been murdered in the terrorist attack. So it was our judgment that the FEST team was not needed, was not appropriate for Benghazi.
But you really didn't know what was going on at that point when you could have pulled.
Well, we did know.
We
knew from the report getting back from our diplomatic security officers that they'd had to abandon the facility, that it had been set on fire.
Okay.
It was they were forced to take refuge with our CIA colleagues at the CIA annex. And remember, the FEST team is not an armed reaction force. That is not what a FEST team does.
Ma'am,
and so
I know that.
we had an armed reinforcements coming from Tripoli.
But that was the only tool that you had to get people over there yourself. Not the DOD.
But what would be what? I'm sorry, Congressman.
Well,
I mean, look.
Evidently, it has served its purpose from being put in the different places it is responded to. But I want to talk to you just a little bit about your emails, and that is that I think you said it was October that you received a letter that asked you and former Secretary of State's to present all their emails. Is that correct?
That's my memory, yes.
Okay. Now, in August, the State Department met with your attorneys to talk about the lack of the emails that they had. Did you know that?
I didn't at the time, no.
You didn't know that they were meeting, that the State Department was meeting with your attorneys?
Not at that time. And as you also